Welcome to Wisdom for the Present, where we take ancient truth and bring it into clear, modern understanding. This episode uses AI-generated narration based on human-researched and written material.
Absolutely.
So, I want you to imagine, just for a second, that you're at a dinner party.
Okay, with setting the scene.
Right, so the food is fantastic, the lighting is perfect, but there's this one guest who has just completely hijacked the conversation.
I may all know that person.
Exactly. They're passionately lecturing the room about, like, the neuroscience of sleep optimization and the exact metabolic effects of intermittent fasting and the profound importance of morning meditation.
Meanwhile, they're downing their fourth glass of wine.
Yes. Pounding wine and just frantically checking their phone under the table. Like, we've all met this person. Honestly, we might have even been this person at some point.
I mean, I certainly have.
Right. But the crazy thing is, 2,000 years ago, the philosopher Epictetus, he noticed this exact same hypocrisy. And he basically wrote a manual to just absolutely dismantle it.
You really did.
So today, we're taking a really specific, just incredibly potent section of that ancient manual. It's chapters 41 through 51 of Epictetus's Enchiridion. And we're going to tear it apart to find the engine inside.
It's such a great section to dig into.
Because this deep dive, it's designed entirely for you listening. We aren't here just to memorize historical facts so you can sound smart at your own dinner parties.
Please don't do that.
Right. The mission is to extract actual, actionable wisdom from this text, to figure out how to operate better in a world that is just, so obsessed with showing off rather than showing up.
And it really is the perfect section for that exact mission.
Yeah.
Because chapters 41 through 51, they represent this profound and honestly kind of uncomfortable pivot in the text.
Uncomfortable is definitely the word.
Yeah. Because up until this point, Epictetus has been laying out a lot of structural philosophy. He's defining the universe, defining our roles, defining what's actually in our control.
The theory stuff.
Exactly, the theory. But when you hit chapter 41, the tone just completely shifts. He essentially drops the theoretical textbook and hands you a hammer.
Just right to the kneecaps.
Pretty much. He's targeting what might be, I think, the single greatest struggle in human development, which is that agonizing, frustrating gap between knowing what the right thing to do is
and actually doing it.
And actually doing it, yes.
Which is, that gap is the exact address where most of us live.
Oh, totally.
We read the articles, we highlight all the brilliant quotes in the self-improvement books, we build these perfect Notion templates for our lives.
Color-coded planners.
Yes. But then our actual daily habits look exactly the same the next morning. So to figure out how to bridge that gap, we really need to look at the heart of his message here.
And the core wisdom tying all these chapters together, it's a radical, almost aggressive demand that we shift from abstract theory into rigorous physical action.
And he uses some pretty intense imagery to make that point, doesn't he?
Oh, brilliantly visceral imagery. In chapter 46, we find what I consider one of the most enduring metaphors in classical philosophy.
Okay, lay it on us.
So Epictetus points out that sheep do not hastily gather up the grass they've eaten and then vomit it out in front of the shepherds just to prove how much they've consumed.
Wow, okay. That's a visual.
Right. He says instead, they digest their food inwardly, and what they produce outwardly is wool and milk.
That is so gross, but you really can't argue with it. Don't vomit grass to prove you ate.
Exactly. The true measure of learning isn't what you can regurgitate, right? It's what your system actually absorbs.
Yeah, the synthesis.
So the central thesis here is that philosophy, or any modern form of self-improvement, it's biologically and psychologically meaningless if it just stays theoretical.
Right, if you're just spouting facts.
Yeah, when we consume information just so we can spit it back out in a meeting or like in a social media comment to show everyone how informed we are, we're vomiting grass.
We're just throwing up grass.
But the wool and the milk, those represent the permanent alteration of your character. It's the patience you show your spouse, or the integrity you maintain under pressure, the quiet discipline. That's what psychological digestion actually looks like.
I love that. And he actually takes this a step further in chapter 49, right, where he targets a really specific type of intellectual vanity.
Yes, the Chrysippus chapter.
Right. So he talks about people who boast because they can understand and interpret the works of Chrysippus. And for those who don't know, Chrysippus wasn't just some average thinker.
No, he was a giant.
He was the third head of the Stoic school, and he was really famous for writing these incredibly dense, convoluted logical syllogisms.
That's very hard to read.
Yeah, like if you could understand him, you were basically considered a certified genius in that era. But Epictetus just completely undercuts that pride.
He destroys it.
He basically says, look, if Chrysippus hadn't been such a terrible, obscure writer, you wouldn't have anything to brag about.
It's such a good burn, because he just strips away the prestige of mere comprehension. He forces the reader to ask, like, what is the actual point of reading these difficult texts?
Right, it's not a reading comprehension test.
Exactly. The goal of philosophy is to understand nature and align your actions with it. So if you only admire the interpretation, if you just love the complex mechanics of the words, but you don't act in harmony with them, Epictetus argues you aren't a philosopher at all.
You're just a grammarian.
You're a grammarian. You're someone who's completely obsessed with the syntax of the map while refusing to actually walk the territory.
Which, it totally makes me think of a guy I knew who was deeply obsessed with cycling.
Okay, the gear junkie.
Oh, 100%. He had the $5,000 carbon fiber bike, the aerodynamic gear, the specialized shoes, everything. And he could talk for hours about, like, the physics of drafting and gyroscopic stability gear ratios.
But did he ride?
Never. If you actually asked him to go for a 20-mile ride on a Saturday morning, he always had an excuse.
Of course.
It's literally like memorizing the entire manual on how to ride a bicycle, boasting to everyone about the physics of balance, but refusing to put your feet on the pedals.
Because knowing the physics of gyroscopic stability doesn't actually mean you can balance.
Right. You don't know what the wind feels like. You don't know the burn in your quads or, the sting of scraping your knee. You just know the theory of a bike, but you are absolutely not a cyclist.
And that right there is the tragedy of the modern human intellect. Yeah. And it maps so perfectly onto how Epictetus breaks down philosophy in chapter 51.
Oh, the 3 topics. Let's get into that.
Yeah, so he divides the pursuit of truth into 3 distinct topics. The first topic is practical application. So, for example, the actual lived rule that we ought not to lie.
Okay, simple enough. Don't lie.
Right. Then the second topic is demonstrations. So these are the philosophical or ethical reasons why we ought not to lie.
The reasoning behind the rule.
Exactly. And then the third topic is the logical connections. This is the deep semantic definitions of what a demonstration even is, what constitutes absolute truth, and how logical syllogisms hold together.
So we have action, explanation, and deep logic.
Precisely. And where do you think we spend all our time?
Oh, almost entirely on that third point. We obsess over the deep logic, right? We're constantly debating the arguments and the semantic definitions in the comment sections online.
Completely.
And we just entirely neglect the first point, which is the practical application of just simply not lying.
And Epictetus points out the ultimate irony here. He says we are very ready to brilliantly demonstrate why lying is wrong at the exact same moment that we are actively lying to ourselves and others.
Because retreating to the third point is safe.
It's totally safe. Debating semantics requires zero vulnerability, requires no sacrifice.
But changing your actual behavior, that first point, that is painful.
Extremely painful. And we see this today with the whole phenomenon of the modern self-help junkie.
Yeah.
We consume endless books on habit formation. We buy these elaborate daily planners. We watch 3-hour neuroscience videos about dopamine receptors.
And the effects of blue light on our circadian rhythms.
Right. We perfectly digest the logic of why we shouldn't doom scroll on our phones at 1 in the morning. Right. Like, we can quote the Andrew Huberman podcasts verbatim.
We are literally quoting them while doom scrolling at 1 in the morning.
Exactly. The knowledge remains completely undigested grass.
Which, it kind of begs a larger question. Why was Epictetus harping so aggressively on this specific flaw? Like, was classical antiquity really that plagued by people showing off their theoretical knowledge?
They absolutely were.
Because we tend to think of vanity and status chasing as this byproduct of the digital age, right? Social media made us this way. But to understand this text, we really have to look at the historical and human context he was writing for.
Yeah, he was addressing a society that was deeply obsessed with appearances, wealth, eloquence, and flexing their intellect.
So ancient Rome was basically Twitter.
Pretty much. If you look closely at chapter 44, Epictetus deconstructs this profoundly flawed logic that people in his society used to basically assert dominance over one another.
How so?
Well, he observes people reasoning like this. I am richer than you, therefore I am your superior. Or, I am more eloquent than you, therefore I am your superior.
Classic status flexing.
Right. And he steps in and corrects this by pointing out the actual logical connection. He says, no, the only valid conclusion is, I am richer than you, therefore my possessions must exceed yours. Or, I am more eloquent, therefore my style must surpass yours.
But you, after all, consist neither in property nor in style.
Yes.
That sentence should literally be framed on every wall. It's just a radical decoupling of personal worth from external attributes.
It's brilliant, because in his society, much like in ours, people completely enmeshed their identity with what they owned or how well they spoke. They were constantly confusing their accessories for their actual soul.
And that enmeshment, it played out constantly in their social hierarchies, didn't it?
All the time. In chapter 46, he specifically brings up this setting of being at an entertainment, which is basically an ancient Roman dinner party.
Going back to our intro.
Full circle. He paints this picture of ignorant, insecure people hastily throwing out undigested philosophical principles, desperately trying to sound enlightened while everyone else is just trying to eat their food.
Listen to my theories on virtue while you pass the grapes.
Exactly. And he explicitly warns his students, he says, do not discourse on how people ought to eat, but eat as you ought.
Just stop giving a TED Talk on mastication and mindfulness at the dinner table and just be a decent, present dinner guest.
Just eat your food.
It's exhausting just reading about it.
It is exhausting.
Yeah.
Which is why Epictetus points to Socrates as the ultimate antidote to this exhausting vanity.
Oh, the Socrates example is so good.
It really is. Because Socrates possessed this almost superhuman immunity to ostentation. Epictetus describes how people would actually approach Socrates, who is arguably the greatest philosophical mind in the room, if not the century. And they would ask him to introduce them to other philosophers.
Which is just, that's the ancient equivalent of going up to a Grammy-winning musician and asking if they can introduce you to the wedding DJ.
It's a staggering insult to the ego.
Most people's egos would completely shatter. They'd immediately launch into a defense of their credentials, like, do you know who I am?
Oh, absolutely. But Epictetus notes that Socrates simply took them and introduced them. The text says, so well did he bear being overlooked.
That is power.
It is. Socrates was completely unbothered by not being recognized as the ultimate authority because his internal worth was so deeply secure. He didn't need the external validation of the dinner party guests to know who he was.
Wait, I gotta jump in here because this just proves the technology changes, but the core human operating system remains identical.
Unchanged.
We act like vanity is this modern disease, but here we are looking at a 2,000-year-old text dealing with dinner party intellectuals trying to flex on each other with their rhetorical skills.
Yeah, the deeply ingrained psychological need for external validation over internal substance, it's just universal. We want the shortcut. We want the applause for knowing the thing without the quiet, invisible hardship of actually doing the thing.
So let's pull these ancient flexes and status games into our 21st century realities. Let's look at how this ancient hardware is running our modern software, starting with chapter 41.
So in chapter 41, Epictetus delivers a warning that feels laser-targeted at our current culture.
Oh, it really does.
He states that it's a mark of want of intellect to spend much time in things relating to the body as to be immoderate in exercises, in eating and drinking. And he advises that these things should be done incidentally, and our main strengths should be applied to our reason.
And in a modern context, I mean, this is a profound critique of extreme gym culture, diet obsessions, and the whole biohacking movement.
It completely is.
But to be clear, he isn't telling us to eat garbage and just stop exercising, right?
No, not at all. He says to do them incidentally, meaning as a necessary background function of maintaining the vehicle, not as the primary purpose of your existence.
Right, because when you look at modern optimization culture, you have people spending 4 hours a day tracking every single macronutrient, plunging into ice baths, wearing continuous glucose monitors, and just optimizing every single bodily function.
And yet if you ask them about the development of their character, their patience, or their moral courage,
they draw a blank.
Epictetus views that as a tragic misallocation of human energy. You are obsessing over polishing the vessel while completely forgetting where the vessel is supposed to be sailing.
Man. And that obsession with the superficial, it extends directly into how we view others too, which brings us to kind of the eerie, prophetic nature of chapters 42 and 45 regarding social media and judgment.
It's spooky how relevant this is. In chapter 45, Epictetus gives this scenario. Does anyone bathe hastily? Do not say that he does it ill, but hastily. Does anyone drink much wine? Do not say that he does ill, but that he drinks a great deal.
Just sticking to the facts.
Exactly. Because, as he rightly points out, Unless you perfectly understand the intricate, hidden motives behind a person's actions, how could you possibly know if they're acting ill?
This is a perfect description of the psychological phenomenon known as the fundamental attribution error.
Well, spot on. Yes.
For anyone not familiar, it's this human bias where when we make a mistake, we attribute it to our circumstances. Like, I cut that guy off in traffic because I'm late for a crucial meeting and my kids were screaming in the back seat.
We give ourselves all the context.
Right. But when someone else makes a mistake, we attribute it to their core character. That guy cut me off because he is a fundamentally toxic, evil person.
Exactly. We assume the absolute worst motives of strangers based on completely superficial data. And this is the exact blueprint for modern outrage and cancel culture.
Just instantly assuming the worst.
Think about it. You see a 5-second video clip of someone doing something, or a single out-of-context tweet from 10 years ago. The immediate societal reaction is never to state the objective fact. They typed these words, or they walked away hastily.
Never.
The reaction is to instantly assign the darkest, most malicious motive possible and construct an entire narrative about their inherent evil. And Epictetus is just begging us to withhold our narrative.
You don't know their motives.
You don't. So state what happened and stop adding your toxic fiction to it.
And what's wild is, while we are so quick to judge other people's motives, we are equally obsessed with broadcasting our own supposed virtues.
Oh, big time. Look at chapter 47.
Yes, I love this part. Epictetus gives this highly specific, honestly hilarious instruction. He says, "If you drink water, do not say upon every occasion, 'I drink water.'"
It is the literal ancient definition of virtue signaling.
I drink water, guys.
Right. You're engaging in a beneficial or disciplined act, like drinking water instead of wine. But instead of letting that act build your internal character, you're immediately extracting the value of that act in the form of social currency.
You want the applause.
You want everyone to know how disciplined you are.
And if you're listening to this right now, just think about how much of our modern culture is built on the premise of pics or it didn't happen.
Most of it.
We post our vegan meals, we post our 5 a.m. workout screenshots from our Apple Watches, we post photos of ourselves volunteering. And this text is telling you that if you broadcast it to your followers, you've fundamentally ruined the internal value of the discipline.
You cashed it out.
Exactly. You've traded a permanent upgrade to your character for a temporary hit of dopamine from a like button on a screen.
Right.
You're constantly leaking your internal power by seeking external validation for your good habits.
We swim in this water every day, you know.
Mm.
It is incredibly hard not to participate in that dopamine economy.
So hard.
But recognizing these flaws is the easy part. The difficult part is figuring out the practical toolkit to actually navigate this. Like, how do we stop leaking our power?
To answer that, we really need to extract the specific daily practices hidden within these chapters, specifically chapters 42, 43, 47, and 50.
Right.
Let's break these down into 4 distinct tools you can use today. And we'll start with practice 1, derived from chapter 43. Let's call it the 2 handles trick.
I love the 2 handles.
It's so good. Epictetus states that everything in life has 2 handles, one by which it may be borne, and another by which it cannot. And the example he gives is just brilliant in its simplicity. If your brother acts unjustly towards you, you have a choice of which handle to grab.
Right. So if you grab the handle of his injustice, if you focus entirely on how unfair he is, how wrong he is, how much you've been victimized, the situation becomes utterly unbearable.
It's too heavy.
The weight of that resentment will just crush you. But there is a second handle.
The other handle.
The other handle is the fact that he is your brother, that he was brought up with you, that beneath this current conflict, there is a shared humanity, a shared history, perhaps even a shared trauma.
Yeah.
If you lay hold of that handle, the situation suddenly becomes bearable. You can carry the weight of it without breaking.
And this maps so beautifully onto modern cognitive behavioral therapy, right? The whole idea of cognitive reframing.
Absolutely, it does.
Apply this to a modern scenario, like a tense family Thanksgiving dinner.
The classic example.
Right. Your uncle says something politically inflammatory and offensive across the table. The injustice handle is, he is ignorant, he's attacking my core values, he is actively ruining the holiday.
And if you grab that handle,
your heart rate spikes, you explode, and the dinner is ruined. But the other handle is, He is an aging man. He is deeply frightened by a world that is changing faster than he can process, and he's basically acting out of fear.
That changes the whole dynamic.
Exactly. And grabbing that handle does not mean you agree with his politics. It does not mean you endure abuse. It just means you are choosing the psychological framing that allows you to bear the moment while retaining your own internal peace.
Because enduring something is not the same as endorsing it.
Ooh, enduring is not endorsing. That's a great way to put it.
And that distinction leads perfectly into practice 2, which we find in chapter 42. Think of this as the "it seemed so to him" mantra.
Okay, break that down.
So Epictetus points out a fundamental law of human behavior. When someone speaks ill of you or does you wrong, they are acting on an impression that it is right for them to do so.
Which is hard to swallow.
Very hard. But they cannot follow what appears right to you. They are biologically and psychologically locked into following what appears right to themselves based on their own lived experience and their own limited perspective.
It's like nobody wakes up, looks in the mirror and says, I'm going to be the absolute villain today. I'm going to believe things I know for a fact are entirely false and just ruin people's lives.
Nobody does that.
Even the most difficult people believe they are the hero of their own story. They believe what they're saying, even if they're completely deluded by bad information or past trauma.
And Epictetus argues that if a person judges from false appearances, they're the ones who are profoundly hurt because they're the ones who are deceived.
Wow.
The truth itself isn't damaged just because someone fails to recognize it. Therefore, he advises that you should meekly bear with a person who reviles you and say upon every occasion, "It seems so to him."
It seems so to them. I really want you listening to use this as a mental shield this week.
That's a very practical field.
The next time you are dragged into a vicious argument, or a client sends you a nasty, unjustified email, instead of firing back with defensive rage, just pause, breathe, and say to yourself, "It seemed so to them."
They're operating on faulty data.
Right. They are navigating with a broken map. Why should you be angry at a person who is genuinely lost in the woods? It diffuses the anger instantly because it creates this massive cognitive distance between their chaotic action and your emotional response.
And creating that internal sanctuary is critical for practice 3, which takes us back to chapter 47.
Ah, the difficult one.
This is perhaps the most countercultural and difficult practice for modern people. It is the practice of secret hardship.
Yes.
Epictetus says that if you want to inure yourself to labor and privation, do it for your own sake and absolutely not for the public. He gives this extreme physical example. When you are violently thirsty, take some water into your mouth, rinse it around, and spit it out, and tell nobody.
Spit the water out and tell nobody. The psychological alchemy of keeping a discipline entirely secret is immense.
It changes everything.
Think about how we usually operate. When we do something hard, we run a marathon, we do a 75-day hard challenge, we donate money, we immediately seek a reward from other people. We want someone to say, wow, you're so tough, you're so generous.
We want the external pat on the back.
But if you completely remove the audience, if there is no one there to clap for you, the only place the reward can possibly come from is your own internal self-respect.
When you endure hardship silently, you are constructing an impenetrable internal citadel. You are proving to yourself, and only yourself, that your willpower is stronger than your base impulses.
You're keeping the currency.
Yes, you are keeping all the psychological currency of that victory. The very moment you tell someone what you did, you cash out that currency for cheap social validation.
But keeping that discipline secret requires an immense amount of patience and endurance, which are virtues that Epictetus believed we simply could not afford to put off for a later date.
No, we really can't.
And that brings us to practice 4, found in chapter 50. I call this the Olympics are now mindset.
That's a great name for it.
Because Epictetus basically reaches through the page, grabs the reader by the shoulders, and demands that we stop delaying our lives. He asks, for what other master, then, do you wait as an excuse for this delay in self-reformation? You are no longer a boy, but a grown man.
It is the ultimate call to psychological maturity. He tells us to treat every single choice, every minor instance of pain or pleasure, glory or disgrace, as the actual Olympic combat. It cannot be put off.
The text literally says, now is the combat, now the Olympiad comes on. By one failure and defeat, honor may be lost or won.
Because we spend our entire lives living in the preparation phase, right?
Constantly preparing. We tell ourselves, I'll start being patient with my kids when work finally calms down next quarter. Or I'll start acting with integrity when I get this promotion and have more security.
And Epictetus is screaming across 2 millennia. The test is right now.
Today.
If you are listening to this on your commute, look at the cars around you. This traffic jam is the Olympics of your patience.
Oh, yeah.
That annoying email sitting in your inbox is the Olympics of your professionalism. There is no magical future date where the skies part and you suddenly become a perfect, untested philosopher. You are in the arena today.
And the urgency of that mindset is what makes this text so timeless. However, as we move into the next phase of our exploration, we really have to be intellectually honest here.
Always.
These practices sound incredibly inspiring, but putting them into action is deeply, profoundly uncomfortable.
Oh, it goes against all our instincts.
When you try to live this way, you are going to hit massive roadblocks, primarily from your own ego's resistance. Like, my ego is fighting back just reading this outline.
Let's talk about the obstacles to growth then, specifically focusing on chapter 48, because this is where Epictetus draws a really hard, unforgiving line in the sand between the proficient person and the vulgar person.
Okay, but we should probably clarify what he means by vulgar.
Right, we need to elevate our understanding of the terminology here. When Epictetus uses the word vulgar, he doesn't mean someone who uses profanity or lacks table manners.
He's not talking about swearing.
No, he is using it in the classical sense of the common herd. He's describing a person whose psychological locus of control is entirely externalized. He defines a vulgar person as one who never looks for either help or harm from himself, but only from externals.
Seeking everything outside themselves.
In stark contrast, the philosopher or the proficient person looks entirely inward to themselves for all help or harm.
And the marks of this proficient person, as laid out in the text, are pretty extreme.
They're very intense.
Chapter 48 says they censure no one, they praise no one, they complain about no one. If they're hindered or frustrated, they accuse only themselves. And perhaps most controversially, if they are censured, if they are harshly criticized, they make no defense.
He makes no defense. That single line causes more friction for modern readers than almost anything else in the Stoic text.
Wait, I gotta stop you right there, because I have to push back on this on behalf of everyone listening.
Go for it.
Makes no defense. We live in a society that demands we fiercely protect our personal brand, our reputation, and, speak our truth.
Right.
If I try that at work tomorrow, like if my boss falsely accuses me of losing a massive client or making some critical error, and I make no defense and just smile stoically to myself, I am getting fired. My career is ruined.
It sounds disastrous.
It sounds less like ancient wisdom and more like a recipe for becoming a complete doormat. So how is this practical today?
That is a brilliant pushback, and honestly, it's the exact danger of reading ancient texts literally without understanding their internal mechanics.
Okay, unpack that.
If we apply make no defense entirely to the external situational world, it absolutely leads to disaster. You become a doormat. But we have to understand that Epictetus is heavily focused on the internal emotional defense.
Internal defense.
When he says make no defense, the core Stoic interpretation is that your soul makes no defense. You don't let the false criticism disturb your internal peace because your internal worth is already secure.
Oh.
It absolutely does not mean you don't calmly present the factual timestamps and evidence to HR. It means you don't defend your ego with outrage, panic, and malice.
Okay, I see. It's the difference between calmly stating, here's the data showing I didn't make the error, versus screaming, how dare you accuse me of this? Do you know how hard I work? You always do this to me.
Exactly. One is defending the facts, the other is defending the fragile ego.
But even with that clarification, it really highlights the sheer psychological exhaustion of this level of internal vigilance.
It is a lot of work.
Because Epictetus writes that the proficient person goes about like a convalescent, someone recovering from a severe, life-threatening illness, careful not to disturb anything that is healing. He says he keeps watch over himself as over an enemy and one in ambush.
Guarding yourself as an enemy in ambush. Think about what that actually requires.
It means you fundamentally do not trust your own initial biological reactions.
Not at all.
You are constantly monitoring your desires, your aversions, your impulses. You're treating your own brain as a hostile environment. That is an incredibly heavy cognitive load to carry all day long.
It is exhausting. And this exact friction between ancient idealism and modern psychological survival means we really can't just swallow this text whole.
We have to apply some critical discernment.
Yes. We're not here to blindly worship Epictetus. We're here to weigh his ancient ideals against what we know to be true today. Which brings us to the necessity of wisdom with discernment.
Right, because our goal in this deep dive isn't to just bow down to a 2,000-year-old book. We need to be careful. Let's reevaluate Chapter 41, the severe critique of the body. He said to treat the body, incidentally, as a mere animal function and focus all our strength on pure reason. Is minimizing our physical bodily existence actually a healthy way to live?
Through the lens of modern neuroscience and psychology, the answer is a resounding no.
Yeah.
The ancient Stoics often operated on a very hard dualism, right? The mind is supreme and good, the body is a flawed, incidental vessel. But today, we know beyond a shadow of a doubt that the body and the mind are deeply, inextricably intertwined. You cannot sever them.
They're a single continuous loop.
Treating the body as just an incidental function while prioritizing cured, detached reason completely ignores the realities of trauma, nervous system regulation, and holistic health.
So true.
For instance, if you're experiencing a severe panic attack, your amygdala has completely hijacked your brain. You cannot simply reason your way out of it with a Stoic syllogism while ignoring your skyrocketing heart rate and cortisol levels.
You can't just logic your way out of a physiological response.
Yeah. Exactly. Your nervous system requires somatic regulation, deep breathing, physical grounding, bodily movement. Taking Epictetus' advice here to the extreme, trying to purely outthink your biology, can actually be psychologically damaging.
And what about the extreme independence demanded in Chapter 48? The idea of looking only to oneself for all help or harm. In today's context, where we understand the deep need for connection, that really borders on toxic individualism.
It does carry that risk, big time. If you rigidly believe that all harm comes only from your own mind's interpretation of events, you risk ignoring profound systemic injustices.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. It can lead to victim blaming, where you look at someone suffering from oppression or abuse and think, well, they're only harmed because they allowed their mind to be bothered.
Which is just a horrible way to view the world.
It's terrible. That mindset completely ignores the reality of community support, structural inequalities, and the fundamental biological fact that humans are deeply social primates. We actually do need help from others to survive and thrive. Isolation is toxic to our species.
The analogy I keep coming back to is wearing emotional armor.
Tell me more about that.
Well, the Stoic mindset, building this impenetrable internal citadel, it's a fantastic armor. If you are marching onto a battlefield, if you're facing a hostile work environment or navigating a brutal divorce, you absolutely need that armor to survive.
Oh, for sure.
But if you wear your heavy steel armor to bed, you're going to be miserable. You won't be able to feel anything. You won't be able to connect intimately with your partner. It restricts your movement, it limits your sensory input, and it creates this massive barrier to human connection.
I love that visual.
Is Epictetus telling us to never, ever take the armor off? Because that sounds like an incredibly lonely, isolated way to live a human life.
That is a really profound way to look at it. And I think the key to modern discernment is seeing this text not as a rigid fundamentalist dogma that you must obey flawlessly, but as an extreme counterbalance to our default state.
An extreme counterbalance.
Think about where most of us start our journey. We are completely naked on the battlefield. We are deeply swayed by the fleeting opinions of others. We're crushed by a single negative comment on social media. We are devastated by minor inconveniences like a delayed flight.
Very true.
If you're living at that extreme end of vulnerability, you actually need the extreme hardened advice of make no defense and look only to yourself, just to pull your psychology back to a healthy, resilient middle ground.
It's like bending a warped vinyl record in the complete opposite direction just to make it lay flat again.
Exactly.
You don't want it to stay bent backwards forever, but you need the extreme pressure to correct the initial distortion.
That's spot on. You don't stay at the extreme of cold detachment, but you use the ancient wisdom to correct the modern imbalance of oversensitivity.
And despite these ancient limitations regarding the body and individualism, this core pursuit of self-mastery, it isn't isolated just to Epictetus or the Greco-Roman world. It's a golden thread running through the entire tapestry of human experience.
It really is universal.
Let's look at the comparative insights here. How do the ideas in chapters 44, 49, and 51 connect to the broader human concerns found in other wisdom traditions?
Let's revisit Chapter 49, the critique of the grammarian versus the true philosopher. The person who knows all the complex words, but none of the actual actions.
Right, the guy memorizing the bike manual.
Yes. This connects deeply to a universal human problem that is heavily addressed in Zen Buddhism and modern psychological frameworks, which is the danger of confusing the map with the territory.
The map is not the territory. The menu is not the meal.
Exactly. We constantly mistake the label of a thing or the intellectual description of a thing for the actual lived experience of the thing.
Right.
Reading a comprehensive book on mindfulness and brainwaves is the map. Sitting quietly in a room, wrestling with your own chaotic, screaming thoughts for 20 minutes is the territory. Epictetus, much like a Zen master, was begging his students to get off the map and actually walk the rugged territory of human experience.
We see another massive universal theme in chapter 51, don't we?
Oh, absolutely. Epictetus ends by giving his students maxims to keep ready at hand. And the first one is a quote from the philosopher Cleanthes.
How does it go?
Conduct me, Zeus, and thou, O destiny, wherever your decrees have fixed my lot. I follow cheerfully, and did I not, wicked and wretched, I must follow still.
Wicked and wretched, I must follow still. That hits hard.
It's the ancient foundational concept of yielding properly to fate. And it is a cornerstone of human wisdom across continents and centuries.
Yeah, you see it everywhere.
You find it echoed centuries later in Friedrich Nietzsche's concept of amor fati, the passionate love of one's fate, embracing exactly what happens to you as necessary and beautiful. You find it in the concept of deep surrender in Eastern spiritual traditions like Taoism.
But you find it right now in modern therapy, too.
Exactly. Modern therapeutic approaches like acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT.
I love the connection to ACT. For those unfamiliar, ACT is all about psychological flexibility. It teaches that our suffering comes from the struggle switch, our constant, exhausting fight against reality.
Yes, the struggle switch.
We say, I shouldn't be feeling this anxiety, this traffic shouldn't be happening, my life shouldn't look like this. We're just constantly arguing with what is.
And Epictetus is saying the exact same thing. The core idea is radical acceptance. You are going to be dragged by the dictates of destiny and reality, regardless of your preferences.
You can't change the facts on the ground.
Right. So the only real choice you have in this life is whether you walk cheerfully, utilizing the obstacle for your growth, or get dragged kicking and screaming, compounding your own misery.
Wicked and wretched, I must follow still. If you fight reality, you suffer needlessly. If you accept reality, you adapt and overcome.
It's that simple and that difficult.
It reminds me again of chapter 44, where he tells us not to confuse our property, our style, or our eloquent speech with our core self. That is the eternal human struggle, isn't it?
Absolutely.
The struggle to separate our self-worth from our net worth. To realize that if the car gets repossessed, or the startup fails, or your professional reputation takes an unfair hit, the core essence of who you are remains entirely untouched, unless you actively give permission for it to be harmed.
It is the ultimate psychological freedom. When you stop looking outward for your validation, when you finally digest the philosophy, instead of just vomiting the grass to impress the shepherd, you shift your entire existence.
You really do.
You move from being a reactive, anxious participant in your life to being a fully self-governing individual.
A self-governing individual. That is the summit we're trying to reach. The goal isn't to become a cold, unfeeling robot who ignores their body and isolates from society.
Not at all.
The goal is to become someone who cannot be easily manipulated by external events, by the whims of fortune, or by the opinions of the ignorant guests at the dinner party.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive into the Enchiridion, I want to leave you with a final, lingering challenge to take into your week.
Okay, a challenge. I like this.
We talked about chapter 47 and the analogy of drinking water when you are violently thirsty and not bragging about it. Sometime today, or this week, I want you to do something incredibly difficult. Endure a minor hardship.
Like what?
Skip a meal when you are hungry. Exercise intensely when you are tired and don't want to. Or, perhaps most difficult of all, show radical, unyielding patience when someone at work or at home deeply wrongs you.
But remember the catch.
Yes, the catch. You are not allowed to tell a single living soul about it.
Not one.
Not in passing conversation. Not as a subtle post on social media. Not even as a humble brag to your partner before bed. Spit the water out in absolute secret. Let that action belong entirely to you, and watch how it fundamentally changes the architecture of your self-respect.
That's the heart of this section. This is wisdom for the present, where understanding leads to clarity, and clarity shapes how we see and live. We'll see you in the next episode.